Dobry večer, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nadia Giriuk, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to War and Words on behalf of the organizers, the League of Ukrainian Canadians, and the Ukrainian Canadian Professional and Business Association, as well as the event sponsor, BCU Foundation. LUC and UCPBA, LUC and P's and B's, combined have 150 years of legacy together. 150 years, with different missions, yet Ukrainian at the core. The League of Ukrainian Canadians is celebrating its 70th anniversary. We're celebrating community work and engaging Ukrainian Canadians, increasing awareness and the positive image of Ukraine and Canada. The UCPBA has also been upholding Ukrainian Canadian culture and promoting good corporate citizenship. Over the years, the members of both organizations have seen different wars. They might have also used different words to achieve their goals. However, with the outbreak of war in Ukraine, there were new challenges which we all faced. And those challenges were especially in the fields of information and journalism. War and words. These two W's carry so much meaning. In the world of information, we try to understand, sort, and find a position that fits our core values. Who is reporting? What language are they corresponding in? Where are they situated? How often do they publish? Is the source reliable? These are all of the questions in the background as we read about Ukraine and Ukraine's Eastern Front. War and words also perfectly describe our guest of honor, Nolan Peterson. He has experienced war as a former U.S. Air Force Special Operations pilot and a veteran of wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And he certainly knows the value of words, as after retiring from the Air Force, he enrolled in a master's degree in journalism at the Northwestern University Medill School of Journalism and embarked on a new journey as a conflict journalist. Nolan Peterson has reported extensively from the front lines in eastern Ukraine. And in the summer of 2015, he was the first American journalist to embed in Ukraine's regular army's 93rd Mechanized Brigade in the front lines of town of Kiske, which is not far from Donetsk airport. As a foreign correspondent for the Daily Signal, he has extensively published English language articles on Ukraine's war. However, the detailed accounts are in his hot-off-the-press book, which is called Why Soldiers Miss War. Very catchy, and it reads like a Mission Impossible movie script. It's jumping out of moving taxis in Nepal, flying over Afghanistan's mountain range with night vision goggles on a combat mission, sprinting for dear life as a sniper shoots at your legs in Ukraine. The text is full of adrenaline, but it's also full of focus. It has contemplation and adventure. It has personal experience and the stories of fellow fighters. It has the story of the world, but within it, it has Ukraine. It's all available today for purchase, and they tell me that the copies are all gone. So if you purchase them, you could get them signed today by the author. So without further ado, and me reading off of a script, I would like to welcome the author of Why a Soldier Misses War, all the way from KU, Mr. Nolan Peterson.
Well, thank you for that very nice introduction. And you should all know that you are at a historic moment. I just got in from Kyiv yesterday, and this is my first book presentation, my first book event. So based on the number of people here tonight, I've got a good feeling that we're going to make some money off this book. But even though I am here tonight to present the subject of a book I've written, we do live in the digital age, so I wanted to start off with a video that I've shot to secure your attention, but also to present to you an experience I've had in the front lines in eastern Ukraine and to hopefully make that conflict seem a little more real before I start speaking about it tonight. So this video, I'll just show the first 5 minutes or so of it, but it's during that embedded assignment I had in Eastern Ukraine in 2015, and I've been to the front lines many times since then, but this particular time was very notable for me as being the first time that I spent an extended period with the Ukrainian army in combat, and also just based on the intensity of the combat that I saw during that visit. So I'll show you a few minutes of this video and then we'll get to it.
Their wartime tank, and these moments, they're too hard.
Do you feel like after being on the front for a few months that you're less afraid now? Do you feel like after being in the ATO now for a few months that you feel less fear during the battles?
Less fear. 2 months ago, I have no fear when shooting, the bullets flying over me, but now I'm see? Down. It is the DNR army shooting at us. The separatist Russian army. It's good. There, we can stand. No.
Yeah, I think you're
Yes, this is bullets.
Yeah.
So this is Pesky.
This is the ceasefire, huh?
Yes, this is it.
This is what the ceasefire looks like. It's been going on like this.
We're not shooting. They shoot us every day.
And it's pretty much been like this since the ceasefire was signed.
Yes.
Now, even though I shot that video in 2015, sadly it's still indicative of the way things are in Eastern Ukraine even today. So as I said, in the summer of 2015, I embedded with the Ukrainian regular army in the frontline town of Pisky. And while I was there, I befriended that young soldier you saw in the video, Daniel Kazyanenko. He was only 19, but Daniel had an amazing ability put the war in perspective. And he understood the toll that combat was taking on his young soul. Daniel knew the war was not black and white. He remembered his enemy's humanity. Maybe they're not all bad guys. Yet Daniel never failed to pull the trigger when he had to. Consequently, the things he had done and seen in war haunted Daniel. He told me that war had ruined him and his understanding of life. He said it would have been better if he had gone to war as an old man. Now, when I left the front lines, Daniel and I pledged to stay in touch. And we talked about the possibility of him coming to America one day, which was his dream. And after I got back to Kyiv and settled back into my life, I received a somewhat disjointed text message from Daniel. He'd been injured by a mortar, he told me, and had what the Ukrainian medics called a brain contusion, which probably means he had a concussion, but more likely a traumatic brain injury. His commanders gave him a few weeks leave to go home to his hometown of Zaporizhia, which was just a 3-hour car ride from the front lines. But Daniel had run out of money on the way home, so he texted me looking for a few bucks. I was more than happy to help out. He ultimately spent a few weeks at home in Zaporizhia, living with his parents, Marina and Konstantin. And it was a tough time for the family, as the parents tried over and over again to convince their son that he didn't have to go back to war. And the truth is, he didn't. You see, when Russia invaded Ukraine in the summer of 2014, Daniel, like so many young men and women in Ukraine at that time, simply headed for the front lines and joined the ranks of an irregular militia that had formed to fight the Russian invasion. Those volunteers learned how to be soldiers while on the front lines, with no formal training. They jokingly referred to it as natural selection training. Daniel, for his part, was only 19 when he went to war. He went straight from living under his parents' roof to living under Russian artillery and sniper fire. There was no chance for him to become a man before he became a soldier. Daniel's mother, Marina, later told me that while he was home on convalescent leave, she would watch her son sleeping and remark on how much he had changed in the few months he had been away. He went to war as a boy and came back as a wise old man, she told me. And on the day he left to go back to war, Marina begged her son to stay. But Daniel answered, "Mom, I have to go back. I have to go back to my friends. It's my duty." And he did. And 2 weeks later, a mortar killed Daniel during a battle in Pisky. In my book, Why Soldiers Miss War, I described how Daniel's parents came to learn of their son's death. I wrote, "When Daniel called his mother from the front lines on August 6, 2015, it was a day like any other. But something Daniel said struck Marina as extraordinary. Amid the shelling, the mortars, the rockets, the tanks, and the snipers, he was complaining about mosquito bites. Marina told her son to be safe. Daniel said goodbye and not to worry. And that was it. It was 10 a.m. when mother and son last talked on the phone. At 5:30 p.m., Daniel died. For some reason, the next morning, Marina didn't check the Facebook page for Daniel's unit, as was her habit every morning. At 10 a.m., a soldier arrived at the door. At the very first knock, both Konstantin and Marina feared something was wrong. They opened the door, and there stood the soldier. "Are you Daniel's parents?" he asked. They said yes. There is no Daniel anymore, he said. And since Daniel's death, I reached out to his parents, and my wife, Lily, and I took a trip down to Zaporizhia to meet them. And during that visit, I asked Marina if it was okay for me to use Daniel's story and her words as a way to tell people about the war in Ukraine and what her son had died fighting for. And she replied, "You do what you can to prevent our boys from dying. The whole world must learn the truth about the war in Ukraine." So here's the truth. The war in Ukraine is not a civil war. It never was. It always has been, and it remains, a Russian invasion. In Ukraine, I've experienced firsthand a type of combat which exceeded in intensity anything I experienced as an Air Force Special Operations pilot in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as what I witnessed in those wars as a war correspondent. In September 2014, for example, I watched a tank battle from a hilltop in the coastal city of Mariupol. It was like something out of a Hollywood movie, except it wasn't. It was for real. The next day, I toured that battlefield. It was September 5th, 2014, the day the First Ceasefire was signed. And in my book, I described what I saw that day and the mood in Mariupol the night of the First Ceasefire. I wrote, "I've been in war zones before. I'm familiar with the spectacle of combat and its associated emotions. But up until now, the human experience of war for me has been limited to interacting with soldiers who have trained for combat and go into it willingly. Yesterday and today, I experienced war in a completely new and alien way. I saw the worry on the faces of a young couple as they decided to part ways amid the threat of an invasion. I'll never forget that. It adds another layer to the absurd tragedy of war that I have never felt before. To watch the streets empty, to see the fear on the faces of people passing by, to look into the eyes of a stranger and shake our heads in mutual disbelief as the sounds of an artillery barrage tear through the late summer breeze. Is this really happening? Our eyes say to each other. It is, says the war. Tank battles, heavy artillery, long-distance rocket attacks. This kind of combat is terrifying. But the terror is short-lived, and the ceasefire appears to be holding. The bars are open tonight in Mariupol. Across town, young brides and grooms are getting married, following through on ceremonies put off for months by the war. Life goes on. Yet out there beyond the city streets, far away from the cheesy music and the embraces of newlyweds, the scars of the last two days of battle are still smoldering. After the fighting ended earlier today, I went out to see what this war really is. Charred bodies dotted the freshly stilled battlefields. These were the bodies of men who did not die well, not by the mercy of a gunshot to the head or the heart. Some had their bodies ripped apart by the concussion of artillery blasts. Some were missing limbs. Some lay with their insides spilled in the earth around them. Others burned to death, trapped inside the steel coffins their tanks became. Quite a few died in the way they had desperately clung to life. Bodies halfway out of their ruined vehicles or splayed on the ground in fetal positions. Soldiers, frozen in the moment and the motion of their deaths, like the plaster molds of the dead at Pompeii. Their lives ended today. The convenient forgetting about why they died begins tonight. And still, as Mariupol celebrates, many more scared and tired soldiers wait in trenches and in tanks, poised to once again release the dogs of war. And of course, the war started the very next day again. Now, I'd never seen a war like that. But what was even more shocking, especially as a journalist, is that it all felt like a secret. And it still does. Today, 5.5 years after the war began in April 2014, Ukrainian troops remain hunkered down in trenches and improvised forts along a 250-mile-long front line in Ukraine's eastern Donbass region. There, Ukraine's military continues to fight a static trench war against a combined force of pro-Russian separatists, foreign mercenaries, and Russian regulars. So far, the war has killed more than 13,000 people, half of whom died after the February 2015 ceasefire went into effect. In October alone, another 9 Ukrainian soldiers died in combat, continuing the pace of one death every 3 days that has persisted for years. And with 1.7 million people who still can't go home due to the conflict, Europe's only ongoing land war is also the continent's biggest humanitarian crisis. The status quo stalemate along the trench lines in eastern Ukraine has developed into a volatile standoff in which Europe's 2 largest standing land armies exchange daily fire. It has become a long-range battle in which soldiers hardly ever see at whom they're shooting, except for the snipers, which I always thought was the most terrifying part of this war or any other, knowing that someone was specifically looking through a scope targeting me. It was a very intimate threat. And the snipers certainly had no reservations about shooting at a journalist, as I came to find out, even though I had labeled practically every square inch of my body with the word press, hoping that would mean something. At some places, no man's land could be several miles wide. At others, the Ukrainians and their enemies are close enough to shout insults at one another. I was in the frontline town of Shirokina when drunk Russian soldiers crawled up to the Ukrainian lines in the night and challenged them to single, unarmed combat to the death, like ancient gladiators or something. It is a bizarre conflict, blending modern technology like drones with battlefield conditions similar to those of the World War I trenches, albeit on a much smaller scale. When not in the trenches, the Ukrainian troops usually live in the basements of abandoned homes. It's simply too dangerous to spend much time above ground with the constant shelling and sniper fire. Psychologically, it's a tough war. You simply can never escape the danger. You could die just as easily walking to the toilet while taking a shower as you could while on patrol or in the trenches. There is no safe place in eastern Ukraine, which is very different than what I experienced as an American pilot in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we did have relatively safe places to go to between missions. Your chances of survival in the eastern Ukrainian war zone usually just depend on good luck and the odds of not being in the wrong place at the wrong time. In my book, I describe what it was like to endure a shelling. I wrote, "A true artillery barrage, when the enemy is zeroing in on your position, is a terrifying thing to endure. It is, I imagine, like being strapped in on an airplane going down. You are helpless. Survival is entirely out of your control. You sit there, looking into the eyes of the man across from you as the ground shudders and things fall off the walls, and you hope beyond hope that this will just end. Those few moments of stone-flat silence between each explosion are the most desperately hopeful you have ever lived. But then you hear the hope-crushing whistle of the incoming round, the high treble blast, the high-pressure concussion, the shaking ground, and then silence again. and more hoping, and more waiting, until there's another shell and another pulse of adrenaline. You inhale sharply and at the top of your chest. The endless pulses of fear make you feel tired, like you have a cold. But you never panic. Panic is energetic, hyperactive, or panic can be freezing, paralyzing. Terror, on the other hand, is just exhausting. Some soldiers laugh at the danger. They treat the war like a sport. Others grow quiet and gloomy, imagining at every moment how they could die. Trench warfare is a true test of a soldier's grit. But after 5 years of constant combat, the Ukrainians have learned how to adapt. For many, war has become their way of life. In Mariupol, for example, there's a restaurant run by veterans that delivers pizzas out to the front lines. It takes about 20 minutes. In one frontline town called Lobachino, which is divided by a river, Ukrainians control one side and combined Russian separatist forces control the other. But there's only one school in town. So each day, the opposing camps agree to 2 short ceasefires so that the town's children can ferry across the river going to and from school. I was out there to observe one of these brief timeouts from the war, and it was surreal to watch the Ukrainian soldiers casually standing on the riverbank, smoking cigarettes, waving at their enemies on the other side. But when the truce was over, the snipers came back out, the soldiers took cover, and the war was back on. There's obviously no love lost between the 2 camps, even though many Ukrainians have family in Russia, and vice versa. In fact, many older Ukrainian soldiers served in the Red Army alongside Russians during the Soviet era. I've even observed some Ukrainian troops sending Facebook messages to their enemies, whom they knew from university or from growing up. Yet the fact is, if Moscow somehow intended to reverse the outcome of Ukraine's 2014 pro-European revolution, then it failed, and in spectacular fashion. Ukrainians' attitudes toward Russia have hardened during the war. An overwhelming majority of Ukrainians now label Russia as the aggressor country. This year, Ukraine's newly unified National Orthodox Church achieved independence from Russia for the first time since the 17th century. Many Ukrainians see religious independence as a patriotic achievement, a defiant act of self-determination, solidifying their country's cultural divorce from Russia. And that divorce began after Ukraine's 2014 Revolution of Dignity, which ousted Viktor Yanukovich, the former pro-Russian president. In retaliation, Russia invaded and seized Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula the following March. Then in April, Russian intelligence agents and special operations forces orchestrated a separatist uprising in Ukraine's eastern Donbass region, creating 2 so-called breakaway republics, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. In the early months of the war, with Ukraine's regular army on its heels, everyday Ukrainians filled the ranks of irregular civilian combat units. A ragtag coalition of Ukraine's regular army and these so-called volunteer battalions stopped the combined Russian separatist advance. It was a grassroots war effort, an example of a society that didn't need to be coaxed into war by propaganda. Ukrainians simply fought to defend their homeland when they had to. By July of 2014, just 3 months into the conflict, Ukrainian forces had retaken 23 out of the 36 districts previously under Russian control. It looked briefly like Ukraine might be able to take back all the territory it had lost. But then, in August, Russia invaded with thousands of its own troops. along with massive amounts of weaponry and military hardware. A conflict that began as gun battles became a clash of tanks and artillery. Many Ukrainians feared a full-scale invasion at that time. Kyiv prepared its metro for use as bomb shelters, and a sack on the port city of Mariupol looked imminent. The September 2014 ceasefire stopped the war from escalating to truly catastrophic levels. And when that first ceasefire collapsed in the battle for Debaltseve, a second February 2015 ceasefire known as Minsk II effectively froze the conflict along its current front line. But the war never ended. As I said, on average, one Ukrainian soldier still dies in combat every 3 days. And civilians still frequently die too, sometimes caught in the crossfire of the artillery or the snipers, but most often these days due to landmines. Some frontline towns like Avdiivka and Marinka have become otherworldly places where children go to school amid the daily shelling and sniper shots. Shops and markets are still open, and families still gather together for meals. For me, this coexistence of normal life with combat was always the most jarring part of the war. Yet unlike what I experienced in Iraq and Afghanistan, Ukraine is not a country at war. The actual effects of the fighting are quarantined to a buffer area on either side of the front lines that extends only as far as the range of the weapons used. The war is a destination. Once you're at it, you're in it. And in fact, many Ukrainian soldiers could drive home from the front line in a few hours if they wanted to. They can leave their heads spinning when they return to what feels like normal peacetime life after only a short car ride from the war. In Kyiv, for example, where my wife Lily and I live, you'd never know that there's a war only 6 hours away by train. But there's another hybrid war going on in Ukraine, which affects the entire country. Since 2014, Russia has used Ukraine as a testing ground for its hybrid warfare doctrine, providing a case study for the new kinds of threats the US and its Western allies can anticipate from Moscow. The power of hybrid warfare is that it weaponizes many pieces of everyday life, including the internet and social media, and my profession, journalism. It's true that the US military dwarfs Russia's, and that Russia's GDP is about half that of California's, roughly on par with that of Spain. But despite its material weaknesses, Russia is a hybrid superpower with an unparalleled ability to control the world's attention economy. Russia has weaponized information by deploying its state-run media organizations to plant fake stories in an attempt to destabilize the West and undermine our institutions. On top of that, historically low levels of confidence in the media within Western democracies has made us particularly vulnerable to these tactics. There's the famous saying that truth is the first casualty of war. Well, in this era of Russian hybrid warfare, truth is not a casualty of war, it's a weapon. And I'll give you a quick example of something that clearly illustrates that point. In the summer of 2014, I was trailing the Ukrainian advance across the Donbass, and I was in the town of Slavyansk just a couple days after Ukrainian forces had liberated it. And I went out to a little village outside of Slavyansk called Semyonovka, where there had been some very heavy fighting just a few days earlier. And this place had just been leveled by the war. I mean, it looked like the surface of the moon with all the artillery craters. Practically every vertical surface looked like a piece of Swiss cheese from all the shrapnel and the bullet holes. But with my interpreter, we wandered around town, and I asked people who, a few people had stayed hiding in their basements during the battle to stay safe. Most people had fled, but by that time, a few people were out and about clearing away the rubble that was left of their homes. And I asked these people, who did this? Who destroyed your village? Who's responsible for the damage? Some people told me it was the Ukrainians who did this. Some blamed it on the Russians. And I went up to one family, a man and a woman and their teenage son, and they're carting away a bunch of rubble in a wheelbarrow. And I asked, I was pretending to be a French journalist, by the way, because I figured that was better than being an American for some reason. When I asked this family, I said, same question, who did this? Who's responsible for destroying your home? And the man looked me in the eye and said, it was the CIA bomber planes. Now, I'm a former American military pilot. And number one, I was unaware that we were out there carpet bombing the Donbass. And two, I was unaware that the CIA has bomber planes. So, still, feigning my French accent, I asked this gentleman respectfully, why do you think the CIA bomber planes bombed your village? And mind you, he had been there for the battle. He was in his basement enduring combat. So I asked him, why CIA bomber planes? And he told me, because I saw it in the news. See, the first thing that Russia did when the war began, they knocked out all the TV towers. And they blasted Russian TV, radio into the Donbass. And they convinced people on Semyonovka who were there for the battle, who experienced it firsthand, that it wasn't Russian or Ukrainian shells they were hearing above ground. It was CIA bomber planes. Talk about fake news, right? And as a combatant who became a journalist, that experience was a wake-up call that my new career is just as lethal as my old one. As a journalist, I wield a weapon as powerful as any bomb or bullet. The truth. Now, for good reason, Ukraine's strategic military doctrine now identifies Russia as the country's top security threat. And Kyiv is rebuilding its entire military with the specific objective of repelling a Russian invasion as well as to meet NATO interoperability standards. To that end, Ukraine's military renaissance has been meteoric. Ukraine possessed about 6,000 combat-ready troops when the war began in April 2014. At that time, it was an ineffective force, gutted by 25 years of neglect and corruption. However, in just 5.5 years, and while fighting a war, Ukraine has rebuilt its military into the second largest in Europe in terms of manpower, comprising about 250,000 active-duty troops. In Europe, only Russia fields a larger military. In the long run, Ukraine is poised to be a counterbalance against a more aggressive Russia in Eastern Europe. It's also important to note that Ukraine's armed forces are now battle-hardened by years of experience fighting a conventional trench war comprising armor and artillery with no air support, practically zero possibility of air medevac, and limited supplies. In short, Ukrainians are used to being on the weak side of a fight against a modern military. And that's not a familiar place for US or NATO troops to be. And for that reason, Ukraine's soldiers have a lot to teach Americans and Canadian soldiers. The battlefield innovations that Ukrainian troops have come up with on the fly and in combat reflect the sort of forward-thinking, flexible mindsets that US and Canadian commanders need to deal with the Russian threat. For example, Ukrainian IT students, information technology students, have built smartphone apps for remotely targeting their artillery. And they've rigged commercial off-the-shelf drones for use in targeting their mortars, even dropping grenades on their enemies. The US military has taken note, and many of the Ukrainians' battlefield innovations are being looked at by US special operations and conventional forces as they train to fight the next war. Of course, Ukraine's military desperately needs to modernize Much of its arsenal dates from the Cold War, and in fact, many of the Ukrainians' Kalashnikovs have serial numbers from the 1970s or 1960s. And nearly all of Ukraine's ammunition comes from Soviet-era stockpiles. And in many cases, deployed troops still depend on civilian volunteers for basic things, like first aid kits, or sometimes even body armor. Yet despite these shortfalls, morale remains high. In fact, the most frequent complaint I hear from the troops is that they're bored and they want to attack. They want to get their land back. They're tired of being sitting ducks in the trenches for Russian artillery. But no one takes the Russian threat lightly. Many troops think that if they just turned around and went home, Russia would simply invade behind them all the way to Kyiv. And they have good reason to think that way. Inside Russia's 2 breakaway territories in the Donbass, there are currently about 3,000 Russian soldiers embedded within a larger force of about 34,000 separatists and foreign mercenaries. And Moscow supplies these so-called separatist republics with weapons and money. And today, combined Russian separatist forces in eastern Ukraine possess about 675 tanks, of which about 500 are operational. That's about 4 times more operational tanks than the British Army has, squeezed into an area the size of America. And remember, Russia still denies that it's involved in the war at all, and says the separatists are simply disgruntled coal miners and factory workers who pillaged Ukrainian military bases for their equipment. There are also about 40,000 Russian troops currently garrisoned in Crimea, and on Ukraine's borders, Russia has positioned about 77,000 troops capable of launching an armored land invasion on short notice. That tenuous, dangerous status quo has spurred other countries across Eastern Europe to prepare for a bigger war. In fact, the entire military balance of power in Eastern Europe has been upheaved since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. Today, the 3 Baltic countries of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are the most rapidly militarizing countries on Earth in terms of defense spending increases. And Poland has dramatically increased its military spending too. And for its part, NATO is rotating military forces and holding exercises across Eastern Europe at levels unseen since the Cold War. You see, the war in Ukraine is not simply a war between 2 countries. Looking back, all these years later, it's clear that Ukraine was the opening salvo of Russia's ongoing war against the democratic world order. And I've seen firsthand how that conflict has spread. I was aboard a U.S. Air Force aircraft flying over the Baltic Sea when it was intercepted by a Russian Su-27 fighter aircraft, like a scene from the movie Top Gun. I was aboard the USS George H.W. Bush aircraft carrier off the coast of Syria, and a Russian submarine was shadowing the carrier while Navy warplanes launched to go into Syria to bomb Islamic State targets. And those U.S. Navy warplanes weren't just carrying bombs. They also brought along air-to-air missiles. The American aviators were going eyeball to eyeball with Russian fighter jets every day over Syrian airspace, and they were ready for the worst. In the Baltics, I've observed U.S. Army Special Forces troops teaching civilian militias how to conduct an insurgency behind the front lines of a Russian invasion force. I covered the 2017 French presidential elections, in which Russian state-run news outlets smeared the campaign of Emmanuel Macron. Last December, I was back in France to report on the Yellow Vest protests. And French officials accused Russia of using propaganda to incite the unrest, and it turned out that a few of the protesters had fought in the Donbass on behalf of Russia's forces. I reported from Scotland, where I learned how Russian media was advocating for another referendum movement in a bid to break apart the United Kingdom. And earlier this year, I was in Kosovo, Europe's youngest country, where I had a chance to interview its president, Hashim Thaci. He told me how Russia, on behalf of Serbia, had opposed Kosovo's bid to join the United Nations, and how Russia was using hybrid warfare tactics to stir ethnic tensions across the Balkans in order to create chaos and reduce American influence. And, of course, I've watched with dismay from afar as Russia has manipulated divisions within my own country, turning Americans against each other. It's easy to believe that history automatically arcs in the right direction, that the era of world wars is over, that it could never happen again. But it sure doesn't feel that way right now in Ukraine, or across Eastern Europe, for that matter. I hope that one day, future generations don't look back on us the way we look back on those who appeased Hitler or apologized for Stalin or Chairman Mao. I hope they don't look back on us and wonder how we didn't see it coming. I admit that standing here before you today in this beautiful place, celebrating my book, it's pretty hard to imagine that another world war could really happen. But I remember 77-year-old Anatoly Bystrisky sitting on a green bench outside his home in Semyonovka in eastern Ukraine, his home which had been destroyed by artillery. Bystrisky was a Jew, was a child when the Nazis occupied Ukraine during World War II. And his family survived the Holocaust, but they lost their home in the war. And when he faced another war in 2014, Bystrisky chose to remain at home and ride out the battle in his basement. Even when artillery destroyed his roof, he refused to leave. The Germans destroyed my parents' home, and I'll rebuild this one too, he told me. Ukrainians have the will to fight. They've proven that. And the U.S. has stepped up and helped Ukraine defend itself, most notably by delivering lethal weapons, like the Javelin anti-tank missiles. Of course, the Javelin won't change the course of the war or even give Ukraine the ability to repel a full-scale Russian invasion. But the weapons have sent a deterrent message to Moscow, and they've certainly been a morale booster for Ukrainian troops. U.S. support in any form, whether through diplomatic gestures or weapons, sends a signal to Ukraine's soldiers and civilians that they haven't been forgotten, and that the democratic world order, which they want to be a part of so badly, is still worth fighting for. And these days, I think that's a message the whole world needs to hear. Ukraine is not just the front line against Russian military aggression. It's also the front line to defend the spirit and the promise of democracy. Ukrainian soldiers, like Daniel, my friend, are fighting our next war so we don't have to. One of my favorite lines from Ernest Hemingway is from his novel For Whom the Bell Tolls, about the Spanish Civil War. And Hemingway wrote, "If we win here, we will win everywhere." And I can't think of a better way to describe, to explain why Ukraine matters to the U.S. and to its Western allies. And so, to close, I'd like to read one last passage from my book, which explains how Ukraine has personally changed my life. In the summer of 2014, I had a one-way plane ticket to Ukraine. I left to report on the war, thinking I'd only be gone for about 2 weeks. Now, looking back all these years later, I know there was only one path I was ever supposed to take. It was that one-way ticket to Ukraine, which led to Lily, my wife. And that path to her was the way back home for which I had always been searching. Home, as I've learned, has nothing to do with geography. And with that, thank you for being here, and I welcome any questions. Yeah.
Mr. Peterson, I think on behalf of everyone, thank you for everything you've been doing. Thank you for coming. I think a lot of us have probably been following the reporting almost from day one. And I think most of us in this room are probably familiar with the situation. However, in your experience and your work, what have you found most effective to communicate the reality of that situation in Ukraine, that war, to non-Ukrainians, to outsiders? How do you get that message across in your own line of work?
And that's the eternal question for a journalist, right? How do you get people to care? And it's particularly difficult these days because certain political personalities occupy most of the oxygen in the media environment in every country around the world. So I think, for me, what I have found effective is to try to make the stories relatable, right? I think even today, introducing me to Daniel and then explaining his tragic fate and how it impacted his family, that makes these stories seem more real. It's not a name on a map in a country you may have never been to, or a war that seems totally abstract to you. If you can try to find a way to make it relatable to people, then it might resonate emotionally in a way that if you're just relating facts and figures, it doesn't. But I think particularly in Ukraine too, for Americans, Canadians, Europeans, I mean, the things that Ukrainians are fighting for are our fundamental values. They, unlike other wars I've been to, Ukrainians chose to follow a democratic path in their future. We didn't impose this on them. They chose it for themselves. They want to be part of NATO. They want to be part of the EU. They want a better life. They want a democracy. And I think, Ukrainians are earning through blood right now the things that we take for granted. And I think Ukrainian story it's a very valuable story these days, where I think many people in our countries, we tend to not appreciate the gift we've been given to grow up in peace and prosperity. But I think Ukraine is an incredibly inspiring story. And in my experience, I've never seen anything like what I've experienced in Ukraine, with one exception, that was America in the days following September 11, 2001. So the short answer is just making it seem human. It's as a journalist, you're always afraid of not being objective, but I think sometimes, it's not a question of not being objective, but to give a story a human face is an important part of storytelling that I think makes these stories resonate much more than any others. So, one gentleman in the back, and I'll work my way forward.
In the 1970s, there were many American Vietnam war veterans that went to Rhodesia to fight, not as it was important, but what they thought was the spread of communism.
Uh-huh.
You mentioned the mercenary in this war, on both sides, I guess. What's it cost to take part? Is it money, mostly?
I think there's many different reasons. There's Serbians and Croatians, for example, fighting opposite sides of the war because they want to kill each other. I've met Chechens on the Ukrainian side fighting because they want to kill Russians. And then there's Chechen mercenaries fighting on the Russian side because they want to earn money. There's soldiers from America, from the United States, who've gone to fight for the Ukrainians because they feel inspired for the reasons I just explained about Ukrainians fighting for democracy. There's soldiers from across Europe who've gone to Ukraine to fight because they oppose what Putin is doing. There's also foreign fighters who've gone to fight on the Ukrainian, the Russian side, because they believe in what Russia, I guess, is doing in the Donbass. And there are, of course, a lot of, out there in the woodworks, there are people who simply are just looking for an adventure, and war promises that. But I think, when history looks back on this conflict, I think there will be comparisons drawn to the Spanish Civil War. Although Ukraine is not a civil war, but there are some similarities in the conflicts. Notably, we're seeing a clash of ideologies play out in Ukraine right now, which I feel is a bellwether for a new era of conflict that will occupy the world's attention in the decades moving forward. So I do think in Ukraine we are seeing, these foreign fighters representing sort of these global conflicts of ideologies, and basically it's, do we believe in democracy or not? And so that's a great question, but there's so many disparate reasons for soldiers who go volunteer to fight in somebody else's war, or journalists who go there. So I'll just work my way forward to the lady.
Thank you very much for your talk. Very inspiring, and I look forward to reading the book. I'm just wondering if you had any opportunity to visit the White House. And if not, when can you get there?
I did have a chance to speak to the National Security Council a year ago. I spoke with Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who I'm sure many of you have seen the news, and I found him very engaging and very, very up to speed and very, very informed about what was going on in Ukraine. I welcome any and all opportunities to share my experiences. My only objective is just to tell the truth. I have no political agenda or one way or the other, but I just think it's important above all, it's important for the citizens of the United States and our allies to understand the truth so that they can make their own informed decisions. And we can't be fooled into any political spin from one side or the other.
There's a debate going on the world stage between isolationism and intervention and so forth, whereas Trump, for example, is reluctant to send troops to, say, fight international waters and wants Europe to do more. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, as far as Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, no comment. I'm not going to comment on things that are hearsay in the media. As a journalist, it's not my place to advocate or condemn any politicians' actions. But I will tell you what I've observed around the world, and that is that America has a unique ability to inspire people to fight for their freedom. And when I've spent a lot of time with the Kurds in Iraq, and I got a great, very powerful story. Was I was in the battle for Mosul, I was with the Kurds, and some of the older Kurdish Peshmerga soldiers had survived Saddam Hussein's Al-Anfal genocide when Saddam had bombed the Kurds with chemical weapons. Horrible, horrible slaughter of the Kurds. And for many decades, those older Kurds would shudder with fear at the sound of jet noise. And on one evening, we were watching American planes come and bomb ISIS, and an older Kurd turned to me and said, "That's the sound of God." And he went on and said, "If America doesn't support us, we couldn't fight." And it means something. America's our support for these people who have, on their own accord, stood up and fought for their freedom. It gives them the strength to fight. In Ukraine, I will say flat out, the U.S. military aid has done nothing to alter the course of the war. But it has raised Ukrainians' morale. It was Ukrainians' bravery and their courage that turned back the Russian invasion in 2014, not U.S. military aid. But it definitely helps their morale to know that we have their back. It allows them to endure these long years of strife and combat. And so I think that America, because we are the most powerful country in the world, the United States, we have a unique and solemn responsibility to support people who are fighting for their freedom. I think that, right now, around the world, there are people who are fighting our wars for us, essentially. And if we want to stay out of foreign conflicts, we'd better honor and protect those people who are fighting for us and prove to them that when push comes to shove, they have our back. We have their back.
I was wondering, where was the, or is the Ukraine conflict one of the top stories in any media outlet? I suppose in Russia it probably is like one of the top stories, but anywhere else in the world does anybody really care to write about it? In the U.S. it's all Trump and that, and Canada. Is there any media outlet, newspaper stories that publish something on a regular basis?
That's a great question, and I think with the recent impeachment drama in Washington, it's kind of a two-way, double-edged sword, to use that pun, but Ukraine's getting some bad press, but also finally we're being reminded of the fact there's a war going on in Europe, right? A trench war ongoing in Europe that's lasted for 5.5 years. It's crazy to me that the war still feels like a secret, as I mentioned in my speech. And yeah, I don't think there are any Western media outlets that faithfully cover the conflict. Unfortunately, because of the way the media industry is these days, most major outlets have really cut back on their foreign correspondent pools. So, you name a major outlet and their reporting on Ukraine is done from the Moscow bureau. And they might parachute in Ukraine for a few days. Their fixer probably hands them a few stories, they write it and they leave. I don't write for a huge outlet, but I do think I have an advantage, having lived in Ukraine now for more than 5 years, that there's a real value to living in a country, for years on end, to report accurately what's going on there. But yeah, I think, the way the media industry is going these days, that kind of reporting is not necessarily valued. And, just take a look at the front page of the New York Times and compare how many stories about Trump there are with how many stories there are about wars around the world. And you can see that most media outlets, they're commercial enterprises and they write stories that sell, not necessarily which stories are most important for the health of a democracy. But I think if you're looking for good English besides my work, I'd say the Keith Post, by the way, does great work. They do really good work, and if you were going to look someplace as a good resource to learn more about not only the war, but Ukrainian society, politics, culture, I would highly recommend the Keith Post.
First comment about coverage. Ambassador Taylor testified last week in the impeachment hearings, and my congressman, met him afterwards and asked him about the situation in Ukraine. And Ambassador Taylor said to him point blank, "You're the first person to ask me about the situation in Ukraine and the war out of everybody I've spoken to in Washington in the last 3 days." So that's an indication of where that stands. But you mentioned your work as a correspondent in Europe. It is baffling to us here in North America, not only how our own governments and media react to the conflict in Ukraine, but countries like Germany or France or Spain or Portugal or Italy, they're literally hours away from Ukraine and the war. And their attitudes about Russia and its aggression and its hybrid war that has already permeated their own borders seems to be somehow a fantasy or unreal to them, which doesn't remind me of appeasement in the 1930s, but seems to speak to me of their dependence on Russian natural resources, long-time relationship, ability to try to talk around the issue. When you were in France and when you were in Spain and in the other countries, what was your sense of the leadership and of the people?
I think, overall, big impression is the same one I get when I talk to people on the street in the United States, and that's just people are like, oh, Ukraine? What's going on over there? There's still a war?
So
Like,
geographic
they're
proximity.
just totally ignorant of the fact that there's still a war going on in Ukraine. Last year, I had a great opportunity. I went, the U.S. embassies in Germany and Austria invited me to do a speaking tour through those countries to share my stories from the war. And I was really shocked at the questions I got in each country. Principally, they all had, the overwhelming majority of questions I got were from people who challenged my assessment of the war. They said it was, in fact, a civil war, that Russia has nothing to do with it, that Ukraine is a Nazi state, and they really believed that the Maidan was not a grassroots revolution, but somehow the CIA had plotted all this up. But, these are citizens in Austria and Germany who have, they're not somebody living in Siberia or something, right? They have access to multiple sources of information, and they were still completely hoodwinked by Russian propaganda. And for me, it really showed me how those tentacles of Russian propaganda, how deeply entrenched they are around the world, and how effective it's been to shape the narrative of the war, like you said, just a few hours away from the actual conflict. So yes, it's an information war, and unfortunately, I think the only solution I can really say is to have more people like me out there on the front lines with my own eyeballs looking at things, reporting the truth as faithfully as I can to describe the war. But the unfortunate reality is that many journalists who report on Ukraine or any other conflict are usually sitting in DC using Google searches for their information. So it's really easy for Russia to shape the information environment, to shape the narrative of what's happening. But yeah, to your point, I think I was shocked at, number one, the ignorance about the war, but also how the Russian narrative, Russia's predominant propaganda narrative, has really taken root in those countries. And that goes for France as well, as Austria and Germany. Now you get a question.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
Clearly you're committed to telling the truth about Ukraine's side. Have you personally experienced propaganda against you from the Russian side? Have they spun stories? Have they...
Yeah, well, I'm taking for granted that I'm a CIA spy. Military background journalist, I've been denied visas to Russia. I think there have been some commentators who have mentioned me in the past and questioned my credentials, my military background. In the comments of my articles, you can see the Russian trolls just going to town on it, just pushing that line about Ukraine being a Nazi country and the Maidan being a CIA coup and all that stuff. My wife and I have had some very serious threats against us to our life because of my reporting. So, to my point, as I mentioned in the speech, that journalism is no longer a part, distant from the conflict. Journalism now is a weapon of war. And Russia uses disinformation in place basically to account for its military inferiority to America and the West. Russia has developed a new kind of weapon, which is disinformation. Disinformation has always been a part of war, but Russia has really perfected the ability to use it to its advantage, to overcome its weaknesses. And so because of that, independent journalists who are out there countering the Russian narrative are a threat. And so it's not only just having your credibility challenged, but also it's, you need to think about your safety too. Thinking back.
Relations with government authorities, Ukrainian and other journalists.
Yeah, so I had been in Ukraine for just under a year when the Ukrainian military announced that they were going to allow for the first time embedded journalists with their regular army. Prior to that, I'd been on the front lines. You know, you have a friend who's in some volunteer battalion that gets you out there, and you know, it's kind of like the Wild West, the first part of the war. But to do like an official embedded program, kind of like what the U.S. military does in Iraq or Afghanistan, it was sort of a pilot project, basically. And they asked for volunteers, and I thought it'd be an amazing opportunity to go out there and see the war firsthand for an extended period of time, and to live with the troops as they live, and to really get to know them. And most importantly, you know, to spend an extended period with the troops, you know, they let down their guard, they begin to trust you, and you get a more accurate picture of what they're going through when you take the time to expose yourself to the same risks and to enjoy the same hardships as they do in combat. I suspect that the Ukrainian military chose me because they saw special operations on my resume, not knowing that as a pilot, you know, I'm certainly not, you know, SEAL Team 6 member or anything. That I had absolutely no idea what to do during the artillery. And, you know, I just knew to run like in a zigzag if the snipers were shooting at me, but that was about it. But I think they assumed that with my military background, I would somehow be less of a liability for their forces out in the field. But I think that was a bold step for Ukraine to make. And there's a lot of sort of latent distrust toward the media due to the, you know, the sort of the Soviet legacy, and they're very, very skeptical about foreign outlets giving them full access to the war zone. But they did understand that in order to, you know, present a more truthful depiction of what was going on in the war zone, they needed to let Western journalists out there and have free access. And so I thought that was a great step for them to allow that. And the stories that I were able to produce, even though I write for a small outlet, they really did get a lot of attention, and I think that they certainly propelled my career forward and allowed more people to trust my work, knowing that I had physically been there, and that I continue to physically be there to report on the war firsthand. And gentleman in the green?
What is your view of the recent Zelensky election for post-Steinmeier formula?
That's a tricky question.
That's why
I think, you know, I've spoken with some of my colleagues here. I think that many of this, by an overwhelming majority, Ukrainians, soldiers, and veterans are opposed to the Steinmeier formula. They think it's a capitulation to Russia, and they think that it's basically an act of surrender. They're also threading a very careful line. They don't want to feed into Russia propaganda that Ukraine is a failed state. You know the story. And so that they're protesting, I guess you could say, almost like with one arm behind their back, right? They don't want to create chaos, or certainly not have these protests or activist marches turn to violence. But there is very widespread, simmering discontent and opposition to the Steinmeier formula among Ukraine's soldiers and veterans. Look, I think Zelensky is getting a lot of pressure from other European leaders to resolve the war. You look at Nord Stream 2, which is going to be a new reality here in a couple months. And I think Europe, they're chomping at the bit to get Russian gas and to renew their economic ties with Russia that have been on hold during the sanctions. So I think Western Europe wants to resolve the sanctions, wants to resolve the war. Zelensky's getting a lot of pressure to make progress. And I think, if he thinks that U.S. support in the long term is in doubt too, he likely thinks that it's better to accept some sort of compromise now, while he still at least has the tacit support of the United States, rather than risk some complete falling out with the United States if Ukraine becomes a partisan issue. But it's, like I said, I don't like to offer my analysis as a journalist, but it does seem like it is a bit of a rushed process at this point, and that perhaps it's not necessary to make such a huge concession to Russia when Ukraine is in a much stronger position than it was when Minsk II was signed in February 2015. In February 2015, Russia could still threaten to invade Ukraine. But now I think that Russia, the prospect of invading Ukraine for Russia right now is a totally different ballgame than it would have been in 2015. I think the cost in terms of blood and treasure for Russia would be unsustainable. So Ukraine, in my opinion, is in a stronger negotiating point than it was those years ago. And so to make that big of a concession to Russia now, I don't necessarily see the fire, I don't see the need. But then again, Zelensky is making the best decision he can based on the things as he sees them, so I guess we'll see.
You talked a bit about being embedded in the Ukrainian armed forces, but what makes a person like you, why are you out there in eastern Ukraine as a reporter as opposed to all the other conflicts in the world? Like how did you end up there of all places, from where you started to where you went?
Great question. I was just trying to get my career off the ground as a conflict journalist in the summer of 2014. And previously I'd been in Afghanistan for a little bit. My younger brother was also in the Air Force, was in Afghanistan, and I was able to get to Afghanistan and to actually see him in the war zone. And I came back from Afghanistan and I had burned through all my savings going to Afghanistan. I actually didn't make a dime. I've lost a bunch of money doing that, reporting on that war. And then I was looking for an opportunity to go back out and to advance my career. And that summer there was the conflict in Israel. Obviously Islamic State was on the march, the Sinjar Mountain massacre and all that in Iraq. And then the war in Ukraine was beginning. And one of my friends from the Air Force, a pilot whom I actually flew with in Afghanistan, he was studying in Ukraine as part of an Air Force scholarship. And so I asked him what he thought about the war, and he invited me to come and to introduce me to some soldiers. And so that was the one conflict I actually had a physical connection to, and so I chose Ukraine. And like I said at the close of my speech, I only intended to be there for a couple of weeks. But when I did arrive and I went to Mariupol and experienced the drama of that battle, I realized that this is a really important story, and the truth wasn't being told, and that I considered it worthy of a long-term investment in my life. And over the years, I've wanted to leave many times, but after I left, I met my wife. I think for the rest of my life, I will always have a piece of my heart and my life in Ukraine, and I'll never fully, truly leave at this point.
Being a former Air Force pilot and a former soldier, but also being married and a family man right now, do you still miss the war?
No. And that's the conclusion of my book, is that I think when, post-traumatic stress is not about a soldier being wounded. It's about, in my experience, a soldier coming home from war and not feeling the same sense of purpose in life that he or she felt while in the military. And modern society is so lonely. We're so cut off from one another. But when you're in the military and you feel alive, or particularly when you're in a war zone, you feel alive to a degree that is impossible to recreate in civilian life. Now, the amplitude of emotions you feel in the war zone just exceeds on a scale you can't imagine what you experience in day-to-day living. And so I think when soldiers come home, they feel most acutely, they feel alone. They feel like they've lost that sense of purpose in life that they had achieved in the military. And when I felt that loss, I filled that hole in my life with going back to war as a journalist, again and again. And I have little doubt that I probably wouldn't be here today if I had not met my wife, because I was taking bigger and bigger risks every time I went out. But I can honestly say, and this is going to sound cheesy, but the only thing that has ever superseded the sense of purpose I felt in war was my love for my wife. It's that same sense of selfless devotion, of being willing to die and kill for something that you feel in a war zone, and you feel when you truly love another person. And so that was the end of the arc of my story, was that in the end, love is what saved me. Any more? I think you have one more question.
You mentioned that Ukraine is now Russia's main national security threat. Who was before? And also, I'm pretty certain the Baltic states work very closely with Ukraine in terms of sharing intel after the war. What are Ukraine's other neighbors, or the actual neighbors, maybe working with at all? What was Russia's now main security threat, and who was before Russia?
I don't know, but I mean, obviously during the Cold War, Ukraine's perceived threat was the West, right? But during the inter-Cold War period until 2014, I don't think Ukraine necessarily gave much thought to an external threat. And I think that's reflected in the fact that Ukraine's military, which has successfully gutted over the years, part of that was a deliberate interference by Russia, because they wanted to militarily weaken Ukraine so that it could never be a rival militarily to Russia and Eastern Europe. But yeah, I don't think Ukraine gave much thought actually to external national security threats. I think, I've written one article that when you compare the drop in industrial output and the drop in population during World War II, you can compare that to the 1990s. The 1990s were actually worse for Ukraine than World War II, as far as the decline in population and the decline in industry. So the trauma of the 1990s, I think, far superseded any perceived threat from an outside country. But, that certainly has changed. And I think that, history will look back on Russia's war in Ukraine as one of the most epic backfires of all time. Because if Russia wanted to somehow bring Ukraine back into its fold, it's the complete reverse. Now Russia has a pretty decently strong military on its border, and a country that I think in another generation, once Ukraine gets its act together economically, can seriously rival Russia for power in that region of the world. And I think that is the course of events in history that Russia set in motion with this invasion of Ukraine. As far as the Baltics, I've seen just some sort of low-level support for Ukrainian troops from the Baltic countries. Some stuff going on under the radar out there that they do to help. There's volunteer soldiers who go and fight. And I think that the Baltics are certainly, just like the United States, they understand that Ukraine is a learning laboratory for what they will face from Russia if there's a war. And so they're certainly studying that conflict and using that as a template for how they can fight if Russia ever were to interfere in the Baltics. But I think one of the most interesting things I observed, talking about the Baltics, is the U.S. Army Special Forces were out there training civilians in the Baltic countries to fight against a prospective Russian invasion using tactics that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban used against us, these insurgency tactics. Knowing how well those insurgency tactics worked against American troops, now we're turning the tables, and if Russia ever invades the Baltics, they're going to get an Afghanistan or Iraqi-style insurgency if they do so. So it's just a really interesting dynamic going on there that we're using our lessons learned from those insurgencies to fight potentially a future war with Russia.
We posit a provocative question. You're here in front of a Ukrainian diaspora audience. Many of the people here are very much involved in community life and in relations with their brethren in their ancestral homeland and support for Ukraine's war effort. What has been your experience or information, or what have you gleaned about the Ukrainian diaspora from your experiences in Ukraine, on the front lines, or in Kyiv, or otherwise?
I think the Ukrainian diaspora are the most patriotic and involved diaspora I've ever seen in my life. You all have made a huge difference supporting the Ukrainians on the front lines. I guess to be provocative, I think sometimes there is a disconnect a little bit between the diaspora and people in Ukraine about things like speaking Russian. A lot of people speak Russian in Ukraine, and that's not an unpatriotic thing to do. I'd say that the overwhelming majority of soldiers, volunteer soldiers I've met in the front lines, speak Russian and are from the Donbass. I think speaking Ukrainian obviously is a way to preserve the heritage and is extremely important. But I also think sometimes that picking fights over things like that is a bit of, in my opinion, it's a bit of an off-track fight when you have people out there fighting and dying in a war. I think that those sorts of things can be resolved when the war's over. But that's just a matter of disconnect between people who endure that on a day-to-day basis and people who are sort of divorced from the realities. But I think, the desire for some Ukrainians to use Vkontakte or something like that, which I've seen some diaspora seriously criticizing. It's like, how could you use a Russian social media platform? Well, a lot of Ukrainian businesses were dependent on that for their advertising and for staying in touch with their friends. Or, an overwhelming majority of Ukrainians have family in Russia, so that's a way to stay in touch with their families too. So I think if I had one critique of the diaspora, it would be to maybe give Ukrainians a little bit more slack when it comes to things like that, because their lives are really, really tough. And they certainly appreciate the help they get. And leave it at that. Hope I didn't offend anybody too bad. This gentleman.
I want to get a comment on just journalism and the truth. You mentioned how it is so difficult for journalists. They're more persecuted, more everywhere in the world than were in the past. And this elusive truth, what is this? Where do we find it? How do you fight it? How do you fight hybrid warfare? Can you just comment on where we're headed with journalism and truth?
Yeah, truth. When I describe combat reporting, my favorite metaphor is the blind man and the elephant, right? If you're blind and you walk up and you touch an elephant, I don't know if I'm touching a statue, a wall, an oak tree, whatever. And that's basically what I'm doing when I'm a conflict journalist. I just have one hand on the war, and I don't really know what the whole picture looks like. The best I can do is just say, without embellishment and without trying to connect dots that I can't connect, what I saw, what I observed in reality, what people told me, what I experienced. I think it's even fair to include my emotions, because I think describing the emotional toll of a war is an important part of the story. But I think a dangerous habit for a journalist to get into is to say, or this one person told me that, so that's indicative of everybody of that category. If I have one Ukrainian soldier tell me that he or she believes in something, I can't say that every Ukrainian soldier believes in that, right? I think that's a dangerous assumption that a lot of journalists make. I think the greatest impediment to truth and telling in journalism is to rely on third-party sources and to not go experience something or talk to somebody firsthand. I think one disadvantage of the digital age is that it's a lot easier for journalists now to be really lazy and to not actually witness things anymore, or to sit, like I said, in a Washington, D.C. newsroom and report on the war in Ukraine. And that allows disinformation to really percolate into our news stories. I think, too, that, like I said, journalism is a commercial enterprise. And in the United States, media companies have discovered that by playing to people's political biases, you are able to get more page views. And I pride myself on the fact that I've never written a story in my entire career that has a political ideology or bent to it. I write purely what I think is the truth, without trying to placate one political sensibility or the other. And I think the advantage of that is, even though I work for the Heritage Foundation, which is a very conservative think tank, I have people who follow my work of every political persuasion. And I really think that's indicative of the fact that good, honest journalism, when you put a lot of effort into researching your stories, interviewing lots of people, going out there and experiencing things firsthand, when you do that, you can cut across those political divides and you can earn the respect of anybody of any political persuasion, no matter who you write for. And I think that my small example is proof that good journalism still matters and that it can make a difference. I mean, you all are here today because I imagine in some way you've either followed my work or somehow respect my work. And I think that that is, for me, I don't get this kind of feedback because I'm in Ukraine and I mostly just get hate mail from Russians. So for me to see the impact of my work, it's very gratifying. It makes me realize that journalism really does matter. And it's really important for people in a democracy to understand the truth about the world outside their borders. Because that allows them to not be hoodwinked into believing in disinformation, into supporting people who, of any political persuasion, who present an inaccurate depiction of the way the world is. Yes?
There are so many people involved in this war. Soldiers come back from the front line to continue their civilian life. So how does the war affect the society? How does it change the society? How do people who come back home feel after the experience they had at the front lines? How does society deal with the trauma, with the war, and with the experiences of those who had it firsthand on the front lines?
I think the Ukrainian experience of coming home from war is very similar to what I experienced coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, in that the war is not an equally shared burden in Ukraine. In most places outside the war zone in Ukraine, life is going on as normal. And it can lead some soldiers to be a bit bitter when they come home to see people out, going to bars, having fun, when they just experienced a year of hell in the trenches. So there is a bit of an isolated feeling, I do believe, among many veterans, because life is going on, and Ukraine has changed so much in the past 5 years while the war is going on. So to come back and see this rapid pace of change, I think it creates this distance in a returning veteran from the lives they left behind, which is really similar to what American troops have experienced coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. Because, like I said, even though there is a war in Ukraine, that war is totally quarantined from the rest of the country. And that you go to Lviv or Kyiv, it feels like a normal country. You would never imagine there's a war going on in that country's territory. I definitely have to add, however, that I believe the war, and this is going to sound weird to say, it's the best thing that ever happened to Ukraine's democracy. Because that volunteer spirit that saved Ukraine in 2014, those volunteers who went out there and literally stopped a Russian invasion or reversed it, they are now transitioning to creating this civil society renaissance in Ukraine. They're taking that volunteer spirit that they once stared down Russian tanks, and now they're staring down corruption. And you're seeing Ukraine's democracy being rebuilt from the ground up, mainly led by those volunteers who saved the country during the war effort of 2014. So I think there is that sense of isolation by soldiers when they come home, but there is also among many a sense of action, of energy. You look at the protests against the Steinmeier formula over the last month. To see that much instant energy to push back against a policy that they disagree with, that shows that people are invested in their country, and that was mainly led by veterans. So I think that going forward, that veteran slice of Ukrainian society, that will be the catalyst to really propel the democracy movement in Ukraine and to hold future administrations accountable to the promise of the 2014 revolution. Is that it? Okay. That's all. But again, thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it.
I'm here on behalf of the UCPBA. I'm a member of the board. I wanted to thank you, Nolan, for making your purpose to keep us informed, and your presentation has been very eye-opening. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, BCU Foundation, for supporting this event and helping us make it possible. In the words of Dr. Rasmus Nielsen, Director of Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford, journalism is an imperfect but important part of democracy. We as citizens are empowered to make meaningful decisions about ideals, interests, and aspirations, about who we vote for, but also whether we want to get engaged in other ways. The precondition for that is knowing something about the world that goes beyond your personal experience. You've taken us outside our personal experience and today, and for that we thank you. So. To get your book signed, have another drink, and nibble on some of the appetizers that are left, and also to ask Nolan any additional questions.
Fair enough.
Ladies and gentlemen, I will be extremely brief. For those who couldn't know me, my name is Igor Kozak. I am a VP of League of Ukrainian Canadians, a co-organizer of this event. I also have a privilege of being a board member for the BCU Financial Group, and BCU Foundation, the sponsor of the event, is part of the BCU Financial Group. Two quick announcements. The first one is that about the book. Clearly we underestimated, the organizer, we underestimated how popular Nolan is in Toronto. If we're breaking ground here, clearly not. All the books are sold out, but there's still plenty of books out there. You can order this through Amazon.com or approach us. We'll be more than happy to help you out to get the books, and we'll try to arrange for Nolan to cite them some other time when he's in Toronto. The second announcement is that tomorrow at 12:30 in exactly the same room, we're having a continuation of this discussion. I will be the moderator. Nolan is still going to be there. So please come tomorrow and join us at 12:30 in the same room. And finally, I just want to say a few thanks. First of all, thank you to all of you. I know most of the people in the room, and I realize that this war has been going on for the 6th year now, and yet for the 6th year, you keep coming to the events, you keep donating money, you keep lobbying your members of parliament, you keep advocating in Canada and across the world, you keep traveling to Ukraine. And so this is what the Ukrainian spirit is all about, and as Nolan said, and I can echo this, being in the front line 5 times, Ukrainian troops out there, they truly appreciate that somebody in a distant Canada cares about them, and it's something worth fighting and worth dying for. I also want to take this opportunity to, on behalf of all of you, with your permission, to once again thank Nolan Peterson and his wife Lydia for coming here, and Nolan for what he does. If you read his bio, and I encourage you to go read it once, twice, 3 times, it's truly unbelievable. It reads like an amazing adventure story. But there is so much more to his life, to his bio, than adventure. If you follow and read between the lines, Nolan was born in a free country, United States of America. He was raised in a beautiful sunshine state of Florida, in a very respectable, beautiful family, well-off, relatively well-off. He had no needs to go anywhere to do anything else. Considering that he was a top student, top athlete, and all his cognitive and physical abilities, he could have done anything he wanted. He could be a Harvard student. He could be a professor at Harvard. He could have gone to the Wall Street and worked as the investment banker. He could have been a top athlete. And yet, at the age of 18, Nolan decided to serve his country. He joined the United States Air Force, went to the military academy, and then he fought for his country in the war. And then, after serving for 10 years in the Air Force, coming from Afghanistan, he didn't do what most of us veterans do, meaning retiring and then enjoying the retirement, enjoying the pension, and moving on with life, building American dreams. He decided to take it a couple levels up and to serve the humanity. He started moving around the world, covering conflicts. He went to Ukraine in 2014, and he told you the stories today. He wasn't a journalist sitting somewhere in Washington or New York, writing stories in the comfort of his office. He was risking his life. And as an officer in the military, and someone who's been there, I can tell you that there are instances that journalists like Nolan, especially him, were risking their life more than some of the soldiers who were fighting the war, because he was going in the areas where soldiers wouldn't go, and he didn't have weapons. He was just running with his camera. So I think having somebody like Nolan with us today is especially important, especially in this day and age, when this world, it seems to be pulled, on the one hand, by the extreme pragmatism, on the other hand, extreme populism, when we're seeing the extreme left, extreme right, extreme political correctness, extreme intolerance, and above all, this tremendous Russian propaganda machine multiplied thousandfold by the power of internet and social media. And so having beacons of truth, beacon of light, people like Nolan who are willing to do this fight for this cause, to deliver the truth, go around the world and speak about Ukraine, what it's all about, what the war is all about, the values, I think it's tremendous. So Nolan, on behalf of all of us, thank you for what you do. God bless you, God bless your family, and please be safe and please continue doing what you do. Thank you very much.